Lady Sky here. Let's talk about monsters. There seems to be a misconception going around that monsters have to fit a certain criteria. I'm here to challenge that misconception. Monsters come in many different forms. There's no simple identifier such as gender or race. Anyone is capable of being a monster. The person next to you could be a monster. Your neighbor could be a monster. Your friends, family, even your kindergarten teacher. Anyone. Sometimes people don't even begin as monsters. It happens over time. Here, in no particular order, are 3 female school shooters. Some were students, some weren't. Each of them became monsters. Number 3, Elizabeth Bush. Elizabeth grew up in a loving home in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Her father Gerald and mother Catherine doted on her and were amazed at how caring their daughter seemed to be. She was shy and reserved, but would come to the defense of those she had managed to befriend. She was deeply religious and had hopes of being a nun. She even had posters of Mother Teresa plastered on her wall. However, her parents were oblivious to the problems hiding just below the surface. Even when Elizabeth changed schools due to the amount of bullying, they never believed it would lead to that fateful day in March 2007. Though all the warning signs were there, she was recently diagnosed with depression and prescribed Paxil. She had also been skipping school to the point where the administration threatened action unless she began attending school regularly. For many weeks, Gerald had been taking his daughter to the shooting range, a sort of bonding activity. He was a gun collector and was happy to share this hobby with Elizabeth. It had been about a year since Elizabeth transferred to Newman Junior Senior High School, a Catholic public school. Initially, she felt she had a friend in 13-year-old Kimberly Marchese, just a year younger than her, captain of the cheerleading squad, basketball player, and soccer player, the very definition of popular. Elizabeth confided in her new friend quite often. Once, Kimberly saw the marks on Elizabeth's arm and questioned her. Elizabeth broke down and admitted to cutting herself because she was depressed. She also told her friend that she spoke to God in her head, but lately could no longer hear him. Soon the bullying worsened. At her old school, Elizabeth was called ugly, stupid, fat, weird, and accused of being a lesbian, even being followed home once and pelted with stones while kids barked at her. Paranoia began to creep in now, and Elizabeth was convinced that Kimberly was talking about her behind her back, as the bullying got worse and worse at the new school. She wasn't wrong exactly, as Kimberly later admitted to taking part in the bullying and mocking her to friends. This was seemingly the last straw for Elizabeth. She grabbed a .22 caliber revolver from her father's gun collection. They were not locked up or hidden whatsoever. She put it in her backpack and headed off to school. She headed toward the cafeteria to confront Kimberly as her feelings of betrayal came to a boiling point. She later said that she didn't intend to actually shoot Kimberly, though she admitted to aiming the gun at her and pulling the trigger. She stated, quote, "I was thinking if I aimed far away from her. I didn't think I would hit her. I didn't think I would hit her with the gun because she ran away." Running away saved Kimberly's life, as she was luckily only hit in the shoulder. Afterward, according to several accounts by students hiding under tables, Elizabeth began pacing the floor and talking about killing herself. At this point, another student, a friend of Elizabeth's named Brent Pock, talked her into dropping her gun. Thanks to him, no other students were injured. The assistant principal arrived, and Elizabeth ran to her in hysterics, screaming, quote, "Oh my God! I shot someone! I tried to shoot somebody! Oh my God!" Hours later, Elizabeth seemed unaware that she'd actually shot Kimberly. She believed she'd missed because Kimberly ran. Her mother spoke to her on the phone later that night while Elizabeth was in custody. When her mother told her that she'd actually shot someone, Elizabeth replied, quote, "I didn't shoot anybody. No, I saw Kim running for the door." I couldn't find much info on the trial itself, but I'll give you what little I could find and the eventual verdict. Initially, Elizabeth was being held in a detention center while she awaited a psychological evaluation. At first, she was to be tried as an adult, but the victim's father showed some mercy and helped keep her case out of adult court. She was charged with attempted homicide and aggravated assault and sent to a juvenile facility. She was released at the age of 18 in 2004, with a stipulation that she will have to wear an electronic monitoring anklet. She's not allowed to go to Williamsport until she's 21, she can't have any access to weapons, and has to continue therapy. Number 2, Lori Dan. This one is rather long, as I wanted to go a bit deeper into it, so bear with me. Lori Dan, also known as Lori Ann Wasserman, was born in Chicago to Norman Wasserman and his wife Edith on October 18, 1957. Norman was an accountant, and the family lived in an affluent neighborhood, in a beautiful home, and were a fairly comfortable family. According to some, she was daddy's girl, and was more than a bit spoiled. For all the love and care Edith and Norman appeared to shower Laurie and her older brother with, it was more gifts than actual affection. The children were well taken care of, for sure, but Norman was either always working or going out golfing with his buddies. The gifts were to make up for the lack of attention, but it affected Laurie nonetheless. She had difficulty even telling her parents that she loved them. By all accounts, she was rather shy and introverted, to the point of being withdrawn, really. She'd barely say hello to those who waved at her in the hallways. She kept her head down and scurried along. It's been noted that while she was quite popular with the boys, she didn't have a single close friend, boy nor girl. She had plenty of boyfriends, but seemed rather defensive around her female classmates. As she got older, her grades declined, but she did barely manage to graduate in 1975 and attend Drake University, then transferred to the University of Arizona after her grades improved. She had goals of becoming a teacher, and began a relationship. Things were looking up for Laurie, but as with most of these cases we look at, that didn't last very long. She soon changed her major to home economics, as she'd recently taken a class in home economics. She also began taking off-campus classes in marksmanship. As her relationship got more serious, she became very demanding and possessive, and in 1980 she moved back home with her parents, transferring to Northwestern University to finish her degree, but after taking and dropping several different courses, she instead just dropped out completely. She just didn't seem to want to put the effort in, and was always making excuses. Those who went to school with her both in high school and in college said they believed she was going to just marry someone who was well off and never work another day in her life. There was always odd behavior from Laurie, including OCD that manifested in her constantly cleaning her hands. Yet she also hated showers and would leave trash all around the house. This behavior became even more apparent in 1982, when she married Russell Dan that September after a 9-month engagement. At first, the couple were as happy as could be, but it didn't take long for Laurie's behavior to go from a slight concern for Russell to an actual issue. She couldn't keep a job, complaining that she wasn't being challenged enough after lying about having a degree to even get those jobs in the first place, including the job at her husband's family business. Which means she stayed at home most of the time. Yet when her husband would arrive home, she'd just be getting out of bed, laundry and dishes piled high, and Laurie herself in desperate need of a shower. Yet it seemed she just couldn't be motivated. Even the brand new and incredibly expensive outfits Russell bought his wife would end up in a crumpled heap amongst already dirty clothes. Not to mention the behavior that Russell initially had mistaken for superstitions. Opening the car door at red lights, tapping her foot on the ground 3 times, tiptoeing on a certain carpet at her parents' home, refusing to close kitchen cabinets. His parents were very concerned about her, and though Laurie briefly saw a psychiatrist, it was no use. The marriage was over a mere 3 years later in October of 1985. Just a year after Russell bought a brand new home, the couple separated and divorce proceedings began. Russell had tried everything to keep the marriage from crumbling, but Laurie wasn't willing to put in the work. Laurie never liked work. Years later, a letter from Laurie's psychiatrist trying to persuade her to continue therapy seemed to show even more than the warning signs were all there. He writes, quote, "I am genuinely concerned about your ability to cope with the problems you've been dealing with." He continues, "I think it is important for you to realize, if you don't already, that the nature of your problems go back long before you married your husband, and it relates very much to your childhood upbringing." He also warned her that her medication would never cure her, merely alleviate some of the issues. Laurie continued therapy off and on, but would eventually quit going altogether, yet another warning sign left unnoticed. Despite that letter, Laurie was determined to get revenge on Russell, and even told her lawyer that she was determined to drag out the process for at least 2 to 3 years. Russell's father gave Laurie's father a deadline for them to come to a friendly divorce agreement. A day before the deadline, Laurie filed for a dissolution of the marriage. She also reportedly told Russell, quote, "If I can't have you, nobody can," because Laurie was quite dramatic. For Laurie, this was all she had ever wanted, and really, all she had. This began the downward spiral of Laurie Dan. Immediately, she began her latest charade, that of a battered housewife, though this too, like her many other short-lived ventures, would eventually fail. There was no evidence, only claims of abuse and a statement from her lawyer saying that he was emotionally dominating his wife and abusing her throughout the relationship and the subsequent separation. Throughout the next few months after the accusation, the police were summoned to deal with numerous situations, including harassing calls to Russell's family, and Lori claiming Russell broke into the home where Lori was staying with her family and vandalized it. It was at this time that Lori bought the first of 3 guns that she came to own, a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum. She told the shop owner and her parents that she needed it for self-defense. The police were concerned and tried but ultimately failed to persuade Lori to relinquish her gun, and without an actual history of violence, there was nothing more they could do, though her parents had promised they would put the gun in a safe deposit box. Unfortunately, odd behavior is not a legitimate reason to revoke one's rights. The calls to police were escalating, though, with more bizarre and desperate accusations. In August 1986, she took a break from harassing her soon-to-be ex-husband, and instead decided to briefly harass her ex-boyfriend instead. She called him up and told him that she had a baby by him. When he didn't believe her, she called the local hospital, where he was a resident, and told them he'd raped her in the emergency room. Around this time, Lori met John Childs, and they briefly became friends. The friendship lasted merely a month, as Lori's behavior seemed bizarre to John and his family, opening doors and picking up silverware using her sleeves, not wanting to be touched, and her frequent hand-washing. John's mother pointed this out to him, to which John sarcastically replied, "I sure pick winners." It would be only around a year later when John would realize he'd gotten lucky in ending things before an actual relationship could begin. In September of 1986, Russell was stabbed with an ice pick in his sleep. He, of course, accused Lori of it, despite being asleep at the time. To be fair, I would have accused her as well. Yet, Russell failed a polygraph and was abrasive with officers. The medical report also seemed to suggest it was self-inflicted, so, despite the fact that Lori had a receipt for an ice pick in her purse, despite the fact that the store owner recalled Lori buying it, and despite the fact that she actually told Russell she did it, cops dismissed the allegations. Fun fact, polygraph tests are notoriously unreliable, and are not admissible as evidence due to that fact. They can be manipulated, and there are numerous reasons one could pass or fail a polygraph test. Around this time, Russell's friends and family began receiving harassing late-night calls as well. The caller would just hang up the phone after it was picked up. She believed these calls to be from Lori. A woman Russell was dating at the time began receiving similar calls and reported them to the police, also believing them to be from Lori. Indeed, the calls were traced back to her family home, and Lori was finally arrested. But, you're saying to yourself right now, this is a video about school shootings. Well, we're not quite done yet. Those charges were dismissed due to lack of concrete evidence. Surprisingly, the divorce proceedings were going well. They agreed to split the money they would get from selling the house, and Russell would pay Lori an alimony of $1,250 a month for 36 months. The harassing phone calls also ceased around this time, but just a couple months later they began again. One friend of Russell states it would happen at least 3 times a night for 5 nights in a row. On April 27th, the divorce was finalized, and there were hopes the harassment would finally be over. However, shortly after this, Lori accused Russell of sexual assault. Hair samples were taken from Russell, and prosecutors decided not to pursue the case. That same month, Lori told officers that a Molotov cocktail had been left on her kitchen table. Police questioned Russell, but no charges were ever filed. More calls were made to Russell's sister Susan. This time, the caller didn't just hang up. They said, quote, "Susie, Susie, Susie, you are going to die. Goodbye." Other times, the caller would say, "I'm a psychopath," and just laugh into the phone. The caller was a woman, and everyone suspected it was Lori. Things spiraled even further down for Lori when she sublet an apartment from a student at the Kellogg Living Learning Center. A student working there said Lori was curious about which fraternities were the best for meeting men. Not long after moving in, Lori was suspected of several thefts in the building. There were also several bizarre incidents that made others in the building a bit uncomfortable, including an incident where she left meat under several seat and couch cushions in the lounges. Lori soon took up babysitting. It seemed that several people, including those that knew she was a thief, among other things, believed that she was quite good with children. She did always want children, so it seemed like the best path for Lori. She herself was very childlike and adored putting puzzles together and playing games with the children, and the children just loved her. Lori was far more open around children, rather than those her own age. However, the trust these parents had given Lori would soon prove to be incredibly misplaced. Lori was swiftly kicked out of the apartment. Her father denies that Lori ever stole any food, despite many students coming forward and saying they saw her do it, though her father did agree to pay $400 to the father of the boy Lori stole from, saying, quote, "There's no way you can prove it." Although many were happy to see Lori go, saying that her lack of cleanliness wouldn't be missed, one of the students' fathers was so concerned about Lori's behavior that he wanted to take out an ad in the newspaper to warn others about her, though the police dissuaded him from doing it. When school officials checked her room, they found more rancid meat on the counter and urine stains all over the floor. While the university evicted her, others were recommending Lori to babysit their children, positively in awe of how great she was with them. A private investigator hired by a now rightfully paranoid Russell found that Lori was sleeping in her car and was only active at night. Apparently, this was the time where Lori would go out and steal food or other things, as there were soon 4 separate complaints about those that she babysat for of Lori stealing clothes and food. An agreement was made with Lori's father that Lori would not take on any new babysitting jobs, but that she would be allowed to continue on with those that still allowed her to babysit for them. She also paid restitution to the families she stole from. Here's where things began coming to a boiling point. Lori returned to the gun shop where she purchased her first gun on December 29th and bought 2 more guns, a .22 caliber semi-automatic Beretta and a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson. She then moved to Madison, another town close by. The phone call harassment not only continued during this time, but actually escalated to the point that 4 separate people from 4 separate families met and wanted to form a task force with police to investigate the allegations against Lori. Indeed, an investigation was conducted by Detective Floyd Moore, who had been assigned to the case. He learned that Lori had been seeing a psychiatrist, and after speaking with her psychiatrist, he determined that Lori was not a threat to herself or others. For a short time, the harassing phone calls stopped, but then Lori's ex-boyfriend began receiving them. Lori moved again, this time into another student housing complex called the Towers, this one off campus. She began seeing Dr. John Greist, a university psychiatrist who prescribed lithium carbonate used to treat bipolar disorder and manic depression, though it has been known to cause hallucinations in some patients. He also prescribed at the time an experimental drug called clomipene, used to treat OCD, though it can cause memory loss in some patients. However, soon after in March, she quit seeing him as well. She lied to students at the Towers, where she was staying, and told them she was a sophomore studying journalism and had just transferred. Speculation and mocking soon began, with Lori being dubbed an eccentric loner and nicknamed Psycho Elevator Lady. Notes were placed at the front desk of the dining room stating, "Please don't let Lori leave and come back for meals." Her suite mates found a note of Lori's that seemed to be a schedule for riding the elevators. This, along with her bizarre behavior and refusal to bathe, was the last straw for her suite mate. She moved out shortly afterward, and no one else was inclined to move in with Lori. That spring, one of the families that Lori had worked for and that had accused her of theft received a harassing phone call from a female. The caller stated, quote, "Your children are going to die." Just a short time later, on March 10th, the wife of one of Lori's friends received a death threat from a female caller. 2 days later, on March 12th, Lori was spotted in a lab at the University of Wisconsin Hospital and Clinics building. 3 days after that, on March 15th, it's reported there were quantities of lead and arsenic stolen from the lab. The day before the theft was discovered, Lori was arrested for shoplifting 4 wigs and 2 hair clips from JCPenney. When she was charged, she told police she was a University of Arizona student. Right before Mother's Day, she made yet another harassing call to Russell's sister. She said, quote, "Susie, Mother's Day, are you all getting together? You shall die." Because, she's one for dramatics. On May 9th, she made yet another call to her ex-boyfriend, who likened her voice to that of the Wicked Witch of the West. She said that he and his children were going to be stabbed. All of this has a point. Don't worry, we're getting close. The Arizona police had plans to indict Lori on May 18th for her threat to stab her ex-boyfriend. However, those plans were scrapped in favor of bringing multiple charges against her in Madison for the numerous death threats she made to both her ex-boyfriend and her ex-husband. They were hoping to hold her without bail. On May 15th, Lori was found by a staff member at the Towers. She was lying curled up in the fetal position in the corner of a 5th-floor garbage room. She was sweating profusely and lying under a plastic bag. It's believed that she left sometime around 4 a.m. Lori was beginning to put her plan into action. Just 4 days later, on May 20th, Lori left the home she shared with her parents and headed out in her truck armed with what appeared to be some goodies, along with the 3 guns she'd purchased previously. Unfortunately, the goodies were packages of food she had laced with lead and arsenic, and she was on the way to make a few special deliveries. Lori delivered the food to a couple Northwestern fraternities, some of her babysitting clients, and even some people she barely knew. She also sent out 2 packages of tainted juice in the mail, one to her psychiatrist and one to Russell. She then proceeded to the home of another couple she babysat for, the Rushes, who told her they were moving earlier that week. She announced that she was taking 2 of their children on a little outing. For some reason, they agreed and sent the children off with Lori. Lori took the children and drove over to Ravinia Elementary School in Highland Park, where she started a small fire. She then drove to the day center at the Young Men's Jewish Council, also in Highland Park, where she was promptly denied entry. She left behind a Mickey Mouse cup laced with poison. Russell's sister Susan had children that attended both of those schools. Lori was not satisfied with what had transpired thus far, so she took the 2 children back home and brought them to the basement. Their mother attempted to check on them, and Lori lit the stairwell on fire. The mother managed to save them through a basement window, but Lori had already moved on. She went to the Hubbard Woods School, where the other Rush children were enrolled. She shot and killed 8-year-old Nicholas Corwin and wounded 5 other children. Lori then drove to a nearby home and fired her last 2 bullets. The first at Philip Andrew, a 20-year-old University of Illinois student, who was luckily just wounded. The second bullet went through her head. Lori never did like to face the consequences of her actions and chose to take the cowardly way out. She will not be missed. Number 1. Brenda Spencer. What list of school shooters would be complete without Brenda Spencer? Brenda was born April 3, 1962 in San Diego, California. Not much has been said about her mother, Dot Spencer. She and Brenda's father, Wallace, divorced when she was about 9 years old. Brenda lived with her father in a tiny home. They shared a single mattress on the floor in the living room, even as Brenda got older. Her father also brought several women home during this time. He later said there was more than one mattress, but would also say they shared. Empty beer and liquor bottles covered the floors. It definitely wasn't a happy life. She would later say there was sexual assault, but we'll get to that when the time comes. By all accounts, she was a happy child growing up. Her father would later mention how she changed after the divorce, though I can't say I'm surprised. Her mother left with her other 2 siblings and never looked back. There's barely any mention of her or her other 2 children after this point. Not only did she leave, but she left her with a man who wasn't fit to be a parent. It's obvious to me that Brenda felt rejected and likely harbored some resentment. In my opinion, this could be her reasoning for shooting elementary school children, to take out the resentment she had for her siblings. This is just my opinion, though, so don't take it to heart. It also still doesn't excuse her abhorrent behavior. Though, as you'll soon see, there were plenty of warning signs of what was to come. They were largely ignored by her father. She'd been sent to a school for problem children at one point, partially due to her depression and thoughts of suicide, and partially due to truancy. Her mother admitted this during the trial, while her father feigned ignorance. He asked, quote, "How do you know if someone's suicidal or not?" A good question sometimes, but his daughter had already shown the signs, and there had been action taken. While she was at that school, in 1978, just the year before the shooting, the staff had even informed the parents she was suicidal. There was nothing secret about it. That summer, Brenda used her BB gun that she normally used to hunt birds, and instead broke out the windows of Cleveland Elementary School, stole whatever she could, and she was arrested for burglary shortly after. Everyone who knew her said that she was hostile toward police, that she had talked about actually shooting a police officer, and in the weeks leading up to the shooting, she mentioned doing something big to get on TV. That December, her probation officer ordered a psychiatric evaluation. It was determined Brenda should be placed in a mental hospital for depression. Her father refused to allow this. That Christmas, he bought her a gun. A Ruger 1022 semi-automatic .22 caliber rifle with a telescopic sight and 500 rounds of ammo to go with it. Brenda claims that, quote, "I asked for a radio and he bought me a gun. When she was asked why he would do that, she replied, quote, I felt like he wanted me to kill myself." Her father tells a different story. He says Brenda always showed a love of guns, and others say she talked about them often. She liked to hunt birds and shoot at cans with her BB gun for fun. Her father had also taken her to the shooting range and trained her on how to shoot a gun properly. She seemed enthusiastic about the whole thing. On the morning of January 29th, 1979, Brenda told her father that she was going to stay home from school because she was sick. He left the house at around 7 a.m. At around 8:30 a.m., Brenda aimed her gun across the street about 150 feet away at a group of elementary school students lining up at the gate to head into school. The gate was yet to be unlocked by the principal. Opening fire, her first shot hit one young girl in the wrist. In total, she injured 8 young children and a police officer who'd been shot in the neck as he arrived on scene. Unfortunately, there were also 2 casualties that day. Cleveland Elementary School principal Burton Ragg, who tried helping guide the children to safety, and custodian Mike Sukar, who died trying to shield the principal and pull his body away from further gunfire. Brenda took a break during the shooting as her phone rang. A reporter from the San Diego Tribune was calling, desperate for a story. He asked her a few quick questions, trying to determine if she was the shooter. She replied, quote, "Yeah, who do you think is doing the shooting?" Almost as if this were a casual conversation with a friend. The reporter asked her the question that gets asked of every monster eventually. Why? She replied, "I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day." An answer that would become infamous for how casual it was. What isn't as well known is what she said after. She continued, quote, "I have to go now. I shot a pig, I think, and I want to shoot more." She then barricaded herself in her home after the 15-minute-long assault, which only ended thanks to a police officer and a security guard positioning a garbage truck in front of Brenda's home. It took SWAT 7 hours to convince Brenda to surrender, and she only did so after she first threatened to come out shooting. She told officers, quote, "It was a lot of fun seeing children shot," saying she, quote, "liked to watch them squirm around after." She was held in a juvenile center until trial. She didn't contest the charges and confessed completely. She later claimed to be on a slew of drugs, including marijuana and PCP, and she claims to have had a bit of whiskey to wash it all down. She now claims this caused her to hallucinate that the children were commandos outside of her window. However, toxicology reports show nothing of the sort. Numerous tests were conducted on Brenda during the pretrial, and it was discovered that she had damage to her temporal lobe. She was later diagnosed with epilepsy. Epilepsy has been known to cause violence and memory loss in some cases. Brenda has since claimed to not have memory of the shooting. She was sentenced to 25 years to life. In a parole hearing in 2001, she mentions rape and sodomy from her father, though there are doubts as to the veracity of her claims, as she waited 20 years to come forward and never mentioned it in the original trial. This hasn't stopped Brenda from stating that she was waiting for the cops to show up and shoot her that day. In letters she's written from prison, she says her father did to her everything that someone could possibly do to a person: physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. She says she suffered from grand mal seizures caused by the injury to her temporal lobe. She went on to say that no one helped her with this abuse, and so she believed it was how the world worked. She stated she believed her father gave her the gun to finally commit suicide properly. Her lawyer states the head injury is evidence of neglect and abuse, and that she should have been on medication for the injury. He also states the shame, inferiority, and powerlessness drove her to this point. My opinion? There is no excuse for murdering innocent people. Brenda was denied parole in 2009. She will up for parole again in 2019. Well, those were our monsters. If you want to see a part 2 of this, leave a like and comment below. Also, if you've noticed a huge change in quality or even a slight change in quality, I'm not sure yet, that would be thanks to some amazing friends of mine who started a GoFundMe and raised money for better equipment. Thank you guys so much. This means the world to me. As always, be wary of the monsters out there.